European Union has largely come together, defying US President Donald Trump's stance to support and aid Ukraine in its war against Russia. But two key leaders, Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico and Hungary's Viktor Orban, are openly challenging this consensus. They oppose funding what they see as an endless war and instead want to align with Trump's vision of a negotiated peace deal. Slovakia has made its position clear. Fico is standing firm against EU sanctions that he believes could hinder peace efforts. The chair this morning, there was a meeting of the Committee for European Affairs where we talked about sanctions, where we informed that Slovakia was behind the removal of 3 people from the sanctions list. We talked about how sanctions take on a completely different meaning over time, and that if they were to become an obstacle to peace between Russia and Ukraine, we're prepared to veto them. Fico is also pushing back against the EU's latest efforts to raise billions in military aid for Ukraine, arguing that Slovakia will not contribute to funding the war. As for providing military aid, it's an individual matter for each state. We repeat that we're not providing any military aid in the form of military gifts to Ukraine. And then there's the initiative of the so-called EU Foreign Minister, Ms. Kaja Kallas, that member states should collect 30 to 40 billion euros. This was supposed to be some immediate financial aid for Ukraine to buy ammunition, rockets, and some artillery equipment. Thanks to our people, who worked very diligently before and at the start of this summit, we managed to insert the word voluntarily into this paragraph. So this whole mechanism is voluntary. Those who want to give, give. Those who don't, don't. Beyond military aid, Slovakia has outright refused to send weapons to Ukraine, breaking from many of its EU allies. I announced, and our people announced, that we obviously won't participate in this collection because it could amount to as much as 250 million euro. I can't imagine Slovakia donating 250 million euros to Ukraine for rockets, ammunition, or cannons today. The divide in Europe is growing. Hungary's Viktor Orban is taking an even harder stance, blocking EU-wide decisions on Ukraine and disrupting financial aid packages. His resistance has sparked backlash from pro-Ukraine European leaders, but he is not backing down. We're not in the majority yet, far from it. Yesterday, the majority of states still supported continuing the war, sending more money and weapons to Ukraine. But it's not the same granite-hard or steel-strong collective will as before. The moment will come here too, just like with migration, when the Hungarian stance becomes the EU's common stance. Now regarding Ukraine's accession, it's the same situation. Apart from us, everyone is still talking about the desirability of Ukraine joining, but numbers are starting to influence thinking. Yesterday, it became clear there's no money. Ukraine's accession would be a massive financial burden for the EU, and there's no money for it. What's their response? Well, let's take out a loan and fund Ukraine's accession with that. But not me, Hungary, don't think it would be wise to get into joint debt with anyone. Orban is also doubling down on his opposition to Ukraine's European Union accession, warning that it poses serious risks for Hungary and the EU as a whole. From economic threats to security concerns, Orban argues that admitting Ukraine would be more of a burden than a benefit. There is a security risk. Ukraine is not a country known for its public security, but all kinds of dangers could come to the territory of the Union. Fico is defending Hungary's decision, warning against attempts to pressure member states into supporting EU policies against their will. Hungary, for the second summit in a row, didn't support the conclusions. The European Council wasn't able to unanimously agree on anything. Is there even any discussion about aiding Ukraine? Possibly, since we know Hungary preemptively rejects such aid. Mr. Reporter, there are always provisions in documents stating that on a bilateral basis, an EU member state can do whatever it wants. But it's the second time, because the Hungarians have unsettled scores with the EU. And as far as funds go, it's a whole problem. We're talking about funds. The Hungarians have their funds withheld, so the Hungarians simply don't approve the parts of the documents related to Ukraine. For Fico, this is not just about Ukraine, it's about the future of Europe. He argues that EU institutions are failing, ignoring key principles of international law, and prioritizing war over diplomacy. Overall, it's noted that a lack of respect for institutions is starting to emerge. A phenomenon is beginning to appear where states are more interested in bilateral discussions. This image problem affects the EU too, because if we look at how the United States views it, they don't recognize institutions, they rather recognize individual EU member states. The growing resistance from Slovakia and Hungary is exposing cracks in the EU's unity on Ukraine. As European leaders push forward with more aid and tougher sanctions, Fico and Orban remain the faces of opposition, advocating for negotiations, national sovereignty, and an end to what they see as an unnecessary conflict. With Trump openly questioning US aid to Ukraine and pushing for peace talks, these two leaders are signaling that they may be willing to follow his lead rather than the EU's.